Right, in the studio today we have Fleachta Phelan of the Disability Federation of Ireland. Fleachta, you're very welcome to the show.
Thanks a million.
And thank you so much for coming in. Firstly, you might tell us what DFI is all about and what your role is.
Sure, absolutely. So the Disability Federation of Ireland is a federation of disability organisations all across Ireland. So actually your own organisation, Blanchardstown Centre for Independent Living, would be one of the approximately 120 members that we have. So disability organisations, some very large organisations that provide services to disabled people, essential services, most of the centres for independent living across the country, and then a lot of condition-specific organisations. So we do have some large organisations as members, but mostly it's medium to small kind of niche organisations across the whole spectrum of disability. So that includes intellectual disability, physical and sensory, neurological, etc. So we as an organisation, we try to channel the power of that federation of members to advocate to the government for better policies that promote the inclusion and the full and equal rights and participation of disabled people in society. So a lot of it is advocacy and policy work, and that's where my role comes in. So my job title is Senior Policy Advocate. So I work in the policy team, analysing and critiquing government policy and advocating to the government, to members of the Oireachtas and to departments who are making policy that they improve the approach that they have to policies that support disabled people.
And a big thing of what you do in DFI is your pre-budget submissions, which are very interesting and very good reading. I was just wondering about 2023, how successful your pre-budget submission was and what areas, or if not fully successful, what areas were successful?
No, that's a great question, and we ask ourselves that every year as well, because it is a kind of a set piece that we do every year. So we develop a budget submission based on the feedback that we receive from members across the country, the issues that are live, and a set of core issues that we've worked on historically for a long time. And it is really important because sometimes it becomes a ritual that every year you do the pre-budget, but to think about what did you succeed in and what did you not succeed in. In terms of last year, one of the really positive successes, I think, was, and often it's small incremental wins that you get. You don't necessarily get the huge wins that you'd want to see and that you'd love to see in the budget, but it's building on things year by year to make little incremental changes that helps. So one of the very positive things that we did contribute to achieving, along with a lot of other disability organisations who were campaigning, was a first acknowledgement of the extra cost of disability. So we know that disabled people live with significant extra costs because of their disability, and a government report that was commissioned a couple of years ago gave us statistics and figures on that, somewhere in the range of 8,700 to 12,300 euros a year. And the report also says our current system doesn't support people. It doesn't give them enough money to cover those costs. So this is something that all of us have been campaigning on for a very long time, very, very long time, decades. But what was really positive this year, from a symbolic point of view, was that the Minister for Finance in his speech acknowledged that. And there was a sentence in the speech that acknowledged the extra costs that disabled people have. And it was a one-off disability support grant is what they called it. Yes. Now, it was 500 euros. And you can see how small that is compared to... Minuscule. So it's completely inadequate. It's nowhere near enough. And we need a lot more. We need to increase the social protection that we give people, but we also need to look at all the services and other things that are costing people, be it transport, medical costs, adaptations and so on. So it's a whole range of things that need to be looked at there. But from a symbolic point of view, it was an important first step to have that acknowledged, and it was a one-off payment. So to some extent, 500 is just far, far too small.
Yeah.
But hopefully that's what we hope, that we can build on that this year as well. And given that we have that precedent set now where they have acknowledged that cost of disability is a significant issue.
Does having a minister at the cabinet table with disability as part of the portfolio, has that helped in getting, access to government?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. Like the minister with the direct responsibility for disability is a junior minister, as you know. So Anne Rabbitte has the brief, and I think we will all acknowledge that she has been a very energetic and engaged minister. She's been trying quite hard, and whatever about what she can and can't achieve. But I do get that sense from everybody I interact with that it does feel like Anne Rabbitte is fighting for disability in the government, and fair play to her, and that's important and necessary. Obviously, the minister at the cabinet table has a long department, if you think about it. So, Department of
he's got about 5 different
equality, children, disability, integration, and youth. So one of the barriers, I think, for that access at the cabinet table was that there was a long pending question of the disability funding and disability services, which were always housed in the Department of Health. This government decided to move those over to that new department. And that's really positive, because instead of having a health model of disability, you bring it over to an equality approach. And that's just a completely different starting point, you would hope. But as you probably know, this just took a lot of time. It was pending for a couple of years. So this year, finally, since the 1st of March or the 1st of April, that budget and that area of activity has moved over to Minister Roderick O'Gorman's brief. So I think once that was within his brief, then he has more of a mandate at the government table, because before that, it was effectively the Minister for Health, Stephen Donnelly, and he had a lot of other areas to be in charge of. So we're certainly, one of the things that we say in our pre-budget submission is that this is the first opportunity for that new department to show their commitment on disability, because it's the first year that the budget sits with them, and the finance. And it is a significant, it's almost 45% of that department's budgetary allocation now. So it's a big part of their brief. So it's really important then that we see that budget increasing and all of the different areas that many of us are advocating on get addressed in the budget. There's a huge range of different issues, particularly around that health money, if you were to call it. So personal assistance, respite, home care packages so people can live independently. But then there's all the other areas like housing, like social protection, poverty, transport. So it needs to be a cross-departmental approach. And that's what we hope the minister is advocating for at the cabinet table as well.
Good. Pre-budget submission 24.
Yes.
At a high level, what's it all about?
At a high level, it's about moving forwards towards independent living. We're 5 years in from ratifying the UN CRPD. So we ratified the UN CRPD in 2018. We're 5 years in. The transfer has happened. We need to be forward looking. We need to move out of crisis mode, because it feels a lot of time in disability like the supports people get only happen when they're in an extreme crisis. And we need to start delivering the right to independent living to people and delivering on what it is that the government has committed. There's only 2 years left in this government as well, so they need to make a significant amount of progress. Our pre-budget focuses on 4 key areas. So the core health funding that supports a lot of the services, including, I imagine, some of the services that you guys provide. Social protection and poverty. We have extraordinarily high disability poverty rates. They're shocking in a very wealthy country. Then we need better supports in housing. We know there's a housing crisis. That crisis is experienced much, much more extremely by disabled people because there's less availability out there. And then finally, community inclusion and participation. So it's communities that people live in, and we need to start building the infrastructure at community level to make sure that we're delivering on the UN CRPD in those communities. So there needs to be funding for that, and we need to look at the barriers to participation, like transport, particularly in rural areas, but also things like assistive technology, etc., etc.
One of the basic headings is income.
Yes.
And income has been eroded real time over many, many budgets. What are you looking for this year?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's actually really shocking when you read the statistics. I mean, we hear day by day how prices are still increasing. Like grocery prices out in the market were increasing by more than 16% this year. So there's a narrative out there that inflation is reducing, the cost of energy is going to come down, etc. So it's not as much of an urgency as it was last year. But practically speaking, for people who rely on our social protection system to survive, that's not the case at all. So if you look at our pre-budget submission, you'll see, and I never want to bombard people with facts, but it's important to know the numbers as well.
Absolutely, it is.
So there's a really important project called the Minimum Essential Standard of Living, which looks at how much do people need to live a basic dignified life, how much money, and they do it in a really interesting way where they go out and interview families and look at the basics, and every year they make a recommendation to the government. And one of the things that you'll find all organisations, not just disability organisations, but all the anti-poverty organisations agreeing on is this: we might all have specific issues, and I'll come back to disability specific after this if that's okay, but we have to give people a minimum essential standard of living. And the statistics that they did last year, in their publication just in June this year, look at inflation. And over the past 3 years, in aggregate, there's been inflation of 18.9%. That is unprecedented since the 80s. It's an extraordinarily high level of inflation. So we talked about that one-off payment that people got last November. We all know that money is long gone. It was spent,
Of course.
it was spent on whatever was urgent in that particular moment in time. When people got into January, what they found was the increase that they had in their weekly disability allowance didn't keep up with inflation. So if I say we had 18.9% over 3 years, during the same time period, the increase that people received in their weekly payment in total was 8.5%. The point being that basically, actually people, as you were saying, have lost money year on year.
Big style.
Now, numerically, they have more of a payment that they're receiving, but what they can buy with that when they go out into the market, if they're paying for their heating bills, they're paying the electricity, they're buying the weekly shop or whatever, they can buy a lot less things because the prices have gone up so much. So it's just, we have to have a system, in the public sector, in other areas of the economy, we see workers rightly securing pay increases from their employers, and we see bits of expenditure adapting to inflation. Essentially, we gave people a cut this year because we didn't keep up with inflation. So we actually need, at a core level, without even thinking about the extra cost of disability, we need a €27.50 increase just to stand still and keep up with inflation. So that's that bit. And then the second bit is the cost of disability. So we talked about the €500 one-off payment. That was a nice symbolic beginning. But what we've always called for is an ongoing, like, cost of disability isn't a one-off. You don't wake up in the morning and suddenly find you don't have those costs. It's not it's a lifelong thing. So we need to factor that into our social protection system. And we've for a long time called for a weekly cost of disability payment. So at the moment, if you're a job seeker or if you're on disability allowance, you get the same amount. But if you're disabled, you have all of these extra costs. So what we call for is really quite meagre, again, in terms of the overall figure of more than €10,000, but we're calling for €40 a week to to be part of a cost of disability payment that comes to people every week.
So even the idea of a universal basic income mightn't necessarily fit because of the extra costs you mentioned that disabled people have, like converting their houses and transport needs and so on.
Exactly that. And because of inflation, there are a lot of discussions at the moment about that issue of, should social protection be indexed, as they say? Should it be matched to inflation? And in other countries, even, believe it or not, across the water over in England, they have a better level of factoring in inflation officially, because at the moment it's just down to the politicians and who they hear from most strongly and who they're worried about getting votes from. Yeah. So that thing of, do you get a $5 this year, do you get a $10 or what have you? But one of the things that it's really important to remember, if we do move towards that, and we should have a system that is matched to inflation, so that at an absolute minimum people are not losing money and getting a cut in practical terms. But if we don't factor in the extra cost of disability when we're doing that, then disabled people will continue to be disadvantaged. So that's the point that we and lots of organisations always make, and I think it's well understood. But there are so many parts of the system that don't factor it in, like even you were saying about housing and a housing adaptation. So we know that there is a housing adaptation grant available for people, but the income thresholds don't factor in the extra cost of disability that people have. So it needs to be across the system that the information from that really important report that was published a couple of years ago is factored in then when we're working on things.
What about things like inclusion and participation for people with disability? Costs nothing.
Costs nothing. Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, there might be a few costs, but not very much, I don't think. Yeah, I think it's essential. I do think, we see things changing in Ireland over time. And if you take the historical sweep, things have improved a lot, even I think of when I was in school relative to now, in terms of inclusion, but we've so much further to go, haven't we? Of course. Like one of the areas that we focus on in our pre-budget submission is at community level, because I think one of the things is also we're still coming out of austerity level cuts that happened across the system. So a lot of the local authorities used to have more funding to support inclusion, and all of that was taken away during the austerity years, and it just never came back. If you talk to the local authorities or the local government management agency, they'll say that. So I think one of the things that we're calling for this year is that there should be a UN CRPD implementation fund, that every local authority should get some money to support making sure that all of the local structures like the PPNs or the LCDCs or whatever it may be kind of explicitly consider disability, make sure that they're inclusive. And then that's even things like funding the transport to get people to the meetings. The money involved to retrofit buildings that aren't fully accessible, all of those kind of things. That's one part of community inclusion, I think. The other part, again, is community living and independent living, and that's where we come back to the funding for personal assistance services, the funding for home care hours. Like, I don't know if you heard on Drive Time last night, there was a young woman called Geraldine Lavelle. And she's 36. She acquired a disability 10 years ago, went into residential care for what was supposed to be 3 months, and has been fighting for 10 years to get to live independently. And she finally was about to move into a really well kitted out house, was very excited about that move. And the issues that continue to occur across the disability organisations around staff recruitment and retention meant that the organisation that was giving her the 56 hours of home care support that she needed to live in the community independently were pulled at the last minute because they couldn't find staff. So it has all these knock-on effects across the system. So that's another thing that we really emphasise in the budget submission, that we have to tackle the pay parity issue. And it's a big systematic issue. So people who do certain work in the HSE and Section 38 organisations who deliver disability supports and disability services are getting paid significantly higher than people that work in voluntary organisations like ourselves. So historically, those pay levels would have been matched to what was there in the public sector. Again, austerity, everything was cut and it's never been made back. So you have pay differentials of about 15%. And we're living in a cost of living crisis. So we can't expect people to work for less. Like, people need to pay their bills also, those who are delivering those services. So the government really needs to address that. Like, it's going to get worse and worse. And if they don't do something in this budget, we see members either going to the wall or having to significantly reduce levels of service. They don't want to, but they can't get and hold the staff because they're not able to offer them a wage that is commensurate with the skills they have and enables them to pay their bills and so on. And all of these organisations, they're not HSE organisations, but their core funder is the government department. So we won't be able to make progress unless we address that as well.
And what about things like health and social care services? They're very important for people with disability.
No, absolutely. And I think now is kind of an interesting time in terms of the health and social care as well, because we have, we know that there's cross-party and there's a great level of support for Fleachta care and for making progress on Fleachta care, though it's been very slow. There is a period of transition at the moment where the health system is moving away from the way it's been organised back to a more decentralised model. So the regional health agencies, I forgot what the A stands for, but it's RHA, Regional Health Agency or Authority?
Probably agency.
It might be areas, is it?
Areas,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
I can't believe I forgot that. So we're that transition is going to happen. One of the things that we've been arguing is that disability needs to be integrated into that. 90% of disabled people don't rely on specialised disability services. That's not where they get their support. They go into the mainstream health system and that's where they get support. So all of that level, there needs to be much more investment there and there needs to be a better awareness. And that's one of the concerns about disability moving out from the Department of Health to the other department, because there's still a huge amount of work on disability that needs to happen from a health point of view.
Of course, there is.
Yeah. But social care is also important. And one of the asks that we've had for a long time, because a lot of our members work on neurological issues, is that there needs to be better investment in neurological support and pathways of recovery as well. And I mean, long term, all of this is a wise investment for the government also, because if you invest early in rehab, you won't have greater health costs in the future. You'll be able to support people to go back out into the community and participate and contribute. So it's win-win. It makes sense.
Of course it is. Tell me this, UN CRPD was ratified, as we know, 5 years ago. But a lot of outstanding issues that haven't been.
Yeah. Ireland was one of the last countries in the EU to ratify. DFI was very active in the campaign pushing for it, as were many organisations. And I think we can see incremental progress. And we were talking about Minister Anne Rabbitte earlier on, and I think she is bringing a lot of energy. And to some extent, I think she was waiting until she could transfer over to the new department and work on things. Having said that, and that's something that we do highlight, do you remember the old election slogan, a lot done, more to do?
Yeah.
Right. So some things have been done. We have made progress, but there are a lot of outstanding policy documents, areas of focus that haven't been published, like things haven't, the The disability capacity review was published 2 years ago. We're waiting 2 years on the action plan that's to accompany that. Now, they have announced that it's been agreed at Cabinet and that it'll be published in the autumn. We've been saying it's essential that it gets published because that has the statistics on the level of need, the investment that's required year on year. But we're also, outstanding is also the UN CRPD implementation plan. So for the first time, we'll have an overarching implementation plan for the UN CRPD. There's a lot of learning from how we've done things before, like through the National Disability Integration Strategy, because we had a huge amount of actions and I think it was very hard to track. The framework should be totally different as well because it's about rights, entitlement, independent living and so on. So that's a very different starting point, I think. So there are a lot of areas that need action and investment. It's not always just investment, it's also implementation.
Implementation is a big one.
And coordination, so cross-departmental, like disability just isn't an issue that can be kept in one department's box. So it needs departments, state agencies to work across their silos, and that can often be challenging, unfortunately.
Of course. It's DFI's job to push government to get all these issues sorted out.
And that's what we're doing, I can assure you. So we published the pre-budget submission at the end of June. Since then, it's gone out in the post to all the Oireachtas members before they went home for the summer break. Our CEO, John Dolan, has been out and about meeting with advisors, spokespeople, ministers, committee chairs, etc. throughout the summer. There's a period, it's a little bit quieter now because everybody has a little bit of a summer break, but we will hit the ground running in September again once the dole comes back, because we all have to put pressure on. We all have to, like, one of the important things I would say even to your listeners is if you care about these issues, which I'm sure you do because everybody has a disabled family member, a disabled neighbour, somebody that they know that is battling these things and isn't getting enough support from the system, go out and talk to your local TD. We all have 3, 4, 5 local TDs. Put the pressure on. Drop them an email, call up the office and say, this isn't good enough. We need more from the government, because that's the way the politics works. Politicians need to hear that this is a concern from their constituents. We had an action campaign where we got people emailing their TDs about that issue around the funding that's there for disability organisations. We ended up with over 3,000 emails sent to politicians across the country. So we're hoping that had some impact, but we'll be doing a lot more over the next month or two to keep the pressure on.
Yeah, there's local elections and European elections next May, so there's probably a window of opportunity to concentrate the minds of the politicians.
No, absolutely. And, you know, we're actually just starting to think about and plan for our election campaigns there.
Yeah.
So one of the things, we are the Irish member of the European Disability Forum as well. So we did have the opportunity to bring a delegation of 13 disabled people over to Brussels in May, where people from across the EU met together to plan for the EU elections and a joint campaign across Europe. But I think the local authority, the elections are really important as well, because that's where politicians start their career. They become councillors and then they become TDs. So I think, as you say, you can already feel in the system that they're starting to think about the elections.
Yes.
So it's a window of opportunity to really get issues on concern. And I do think a lot of local councillors, this, just like TDs in their clinics, they hear these issues every day. They know what the lived reality is because they're supporting constituents. They're on to the local authority about this grant or the delay on this or whatever it may be. So we just need to translate that into action in the system. You know,
the big final question.
Oh,
how successful do you think the pre-budget submission will be?
That's $1 million question, isn't it? It's funny. It's a funny one, isn't it? Because, you know, you have to ask big every year. You have to lay out your stall. I was reading the pre-budget submission again on the bus coming out to you, and you know, I'm really proud of it actually when I look at it, because I think we've done a very good job of tying things together and outlining the 4 core pillars of what needs to happen and move. It's a little bit hard to know because I think the government narrative is always there are limited resources, there's only so much we can spend, inflation, etc., etc. We've been highlighting the fact that, look, the economy is in rude health. We do have the resources. Not only that, but we have capital resources now. Like, we know that there's investments that can be made. If we want to do one-off capital investments in building or whatever, let's go out and retrofit a lot of homes and make them fully accessible. That's an investment for the future. Exactly what we'll get, I don't know, but I could tell you we won't be found wanting and fighting for it.
Good. Fleachta, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks a million. Thanks for having me.